welcome to everybody who's joining us for our Learning Community Talk with Ian Rosenblum. Ian, as you all know, is the Acting Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education. And we're really pleased that Ian can join us today to talk a little bit more about ESSER 3 and ARPA and what advocates need to know to work with state and local leaders to prioritize spending to meet their community's COVID recovery needs. As with all of our talks, I'm going to give Ian a little bit of time to just give us a little bit of information, and then we will have a conversation. And you can post your questions in the Q&A box at any time. I'll be looking at that and asking Ian those questions. And we are, of course, recording today for people who were not able to join us so that they can watch this on Slack later. But if you're on, you get the benefit of being able to ask your questions. Also, we're ending today at exactly 4:30 because Ian is, as you can already tell, a very busy person. So I don't want to spend any more time on the I think we've done everything we need to do in the introduction. So let me just turn it over to you, Ian, for a few minutes to just talk about ESSER, ARPA, community engagement, what you're seeing. Just lay it out for us, give us a little bit of background.
Absolutely, I would love to. First of all, I'm just so happy to be here and getting to talk with you. I'll just chat for a few minutes about the American Rescue Plan, and in particular, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, and then really eager to hear your questions and engage in conversation. I think, just broadly, there are a few areas that we as the department are intensely focused on right now. One, ensuring that schools and districts and states have the resources that they need to address the health and safety of students and educators as we return to in-person instruction and continue the return to in-person instruction and sustain it. Second, that we're thinking about ways to build parents' confidence and ensure that we are supporting school districts and schools and engaging with parents in doing so in families' home languages and in ways that are supportive and that are really respectful of the experience of families, including the experience with families with their schools before the pandemic. And so thinking about all of those factors and being a resource and a support. And third, that we're focusing on the needs of all students, that we're taking an equity lens as we think about this next phase and how we're addressing the needs of all students, including the students most impacted by the pandemic, and including in ways that address the inequities that pre-existed and were exacerbated by the pandemic. I'll talk the most about the American Rescue Plan's Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. As I said, some people call it ESSER 3, we don't, which is $122 billion. And then I would just also flag another absolutely critical investment in the American Rescue Plan is the $800 million in support for students experiencing homelessness. And just last week, we put out the application to states to access the final $600 million of that $800 million. So we are eager for that to get out, for it to be used to identify students, to provide wraparound services to students, and so happy to talk about that as well. From the department's perspective, the secretary talks a lot about how he views the department as a service agency. And so that is ingrained in all aspects of our work right now. We're working really hard to lift up best practices. We've created a best practice clearinghouse. We're eager to find great examples of things that are working and be able to share it with other educators across the country. We're also focused on providing guidance, and this can be very technical. It could also be more aspirational. How do you help states and school districts and schools think about the different opportunities as they're able to make these really critical investment decisions using the American Rescue Plan and the other pandemic relief funds. We're focused on reporting and transparency. That has been a critical aspect of the work that we're doing on technical assistance. And Sandy, as you mentioned, on stakeholder engagement. We have made stakeholder engagement a very high priority as we've rolled out the American Rescue Plan. And we've done that because we think the best decisions will be made when there are critical voices at the table of those who are most impacted by those decisions. And so when we created a requirement for American Rescue Plan state plans and local school district use of funds plans, we intentionally also established a requirement that states and school districts engage in really extensive stakeholder engagement in order to develop their plans, and that was a required element, and that stakeholder engagement be broad and representative. A few things as we move into the next phase of this work. We are focused on that stakeholder engagement, on really seeing that play out. We're focused on the state plans. Last week, we approved the first 7 state plans and released funds to those states. You'll hear more from us soon as we continue to approve state plans. We're focused on how those plans and the actual implementation are addressing educational equity. That includes the set-asides that states have, the 5% of funds that have to be used for evidence-based interventions that address the impact of lost instructional time, the 1% for evidence-based interventions that provide summer learning and enrichment, and the 1% for comprehensive after-school programs. Again, all those evidence-based, all of them focused on the students most impacted by the pandemic. We're focused on supporting states and school districts in the uses of funds and how we can provide technical assistance and guidance to make sure that can happen in ways that are both flexible and rooted in the purposes of the law. And we're focused on maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity, which are 2 really critical provisions in the American Rescue Plan that are designed to make sure that the resources are actually providing net new support to students. So that's the quick version of $130 billion, and I'm happy to stop there and would love to hear what's on everyone's mind and how they're experiencing the rollout of these funds and the different aspects of engagement around their use.
That's a great place to start. Let me just ask you, how many state plans have you received?
We've received, I think as of today, we're at 40 plans, 40 states plus the District of Columbia.
Right, and you've approved Arkansas, DC, Texas, South Dakota, Massachusetts, Utah, and Rhode Island. And
that's right.
Right, you bounced just one state's plan back? Is that right?
We are not bouncing any state's plans back.
Did you ask for additional information from just one?
We've asked for additional information from many states. I think generally, there are a lot of questions that we ask, and so it is absolutely natural that there are places where we'll either ask states for additional information or to clarify something in their state plan, and that's just a normal back and forth process.
Sure, of course, and that makes a lot of sense. But I'm curious, between the plans that have been approved and the plans where you're asking questions, what are you seeing in those plans that have already been approved, and what are the kinds of questions that are coming up, and in that, are you seeing or some of the questions you're asking about the meaningful community involvement? Is that something that's coming up in your back and forth? Just curious about that.
Yeah, I think a few of the things that we're seeing in the plans are, one, that commitment to stakeholder engagement, 2, a lot of real clarity around what a state's specific priorities are, and then how those priorities are driving their funding decisions. We're seeing states take different approaches to how they're thinking about those evidence-based interventions that I mentioned. Some are saying, very clearly, we are doing X, Y, and Z starting this summer with our summer programs. Others that are saying, here's the process that we have in place to make our final decisions about how we'll use those resources. And so we're seeing both of those types of things in plans. And we're seeing a lot of focus on the students most impacted by the pandemic and robustly addressing their social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs through comprehensive strategies. As we go back to states, I think the questions are sort of all over the board, and some of the requirements in the state plan are quite specific. So for example, Sandy, you mentioned stakeholder engagement. We list out a comprehensive set of stakeholders, and the state plan has to describe how each of those stakeholder groups was engaged. Not just we did stakeholder engagement, but we engaged students, we engaged parents, et cetera. And so, in a list like that, it's natural that a state might leave out one of them. And so we say, can you tell us how you engage that particular group? And we see that in, different areas, certainly not just that one.
Here's a question that just came in. Are your back and forth with states The questions that you've asked, is that publicly available for folks
That's a
to?
great question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, so the plans are clearly publicly available, but it would be interesting to know about the back and forth. Because I think
I just saw that North Carolina, an email that we sent to North Carolina, I think was just like posted by a North Carolina outlet. So I assume.
That's what, well, that's funny because I was thinking about when I said bounce back, I was thinking about North Carolina because people have picked up on the North Carolina.
We do. So we've made it a priority to post the plans as soon as they came into the department. So when they're just in their, in their submitted stage while they're being reviewed, because we want them to be available to the public. And then we also post the final version, the approved version, which reflects any additional information that the state provided. So we want it all to be transparent.
Okay. So we can check with your office later to see whether the correspondence is something that's publicly available. Because I think that, yeah, that could be helpful. Just to back up for a second, if you could just maybe recap for people again, like what are allowable uses for the funds and what are the limitations on both states and LEAs?
Sure. The allowable uses are really quite broad. I mean, there's an overall umbrella of being in preparation for response to the pandemic. Obviously, the uses of funds have to, meet federal guidelines. They have to be appropriate uses of spending. But there's a lot of flexibility for school districts to make decisions about how the resources, what resources will best meet their needs. And, I often think about it in sort of three buckets of types of decisions that school districts are making. There's a set of one-time costs that are sort of immediate that they need, often health and safety. So a school district needs to upgrade its HVAC system, right? That's a one-time cost. It's obviously directly linked to the pandemic. Second bucket is heightened student needs resulting from the pandemic. And so a school district might say, for the next year and a half, we're going to need X more mental health professionals than we otherwise would have in order to support students and educators. Third is a set of needs that are ongoing that likely pre-existed and where American Rescue Plan and other pandemic relief funds can help make a down payment on critically important investments in supporting students on an ongoing basis. And so, again, school districts have a huge amount of flexibility. The reason I'm leading with school districts here is because school districts are responsible for at least 90% of American Rescue Plan ESSER funds. They flow to the state and then directly from the state to the school district. And those funding decisions are made at the school district level. School districts have to spend at least 20% of their funds on evidence-based interventions that address the impact of lost instructional time, but they have a great deal of flexibility. The states also obviously have considerable funds. They have there's some requirements around those resources. So they have, as I mentioned, those buckets that are required to be used for the academic impact of lost instructional time, for summer learning and enrichment, and for comprehensive after-school programs. And then they have a little bit more that they can use for administration and for emergency uses as defined by the state. So they also have a great deal of flexibility, but many of the key decisions will be made at the local level.
Does the best practices clearinghouse that you mentioned before, is that only around state plans and state issues, or does it include LEA information too, or best practices stuff that's like research based? Maybe I should have just asked you, tell me more about what's in the best practices clearinghouse.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the best practices clearinghouse is intentionally educators and schools and school districts sharing with one another. So they're saying this is something that worked in our community. It could be around health and safety, it could be around meeting students' needs, it could be around supporting educators, and we want to share it with others. It's not the What Works Clearinghouse, right? Like it's not an evidence-based set of resources that are evaluated based on set criteria. The intention here is different. As the secretary says, teachers learn best from teachers, principals learn best from principals. What we wanted to do as a department was create a vehicle for educators and others to share with one another the things that they see as working in their schools and communities.
So we know one thing that we've been hearing at both the state and the local level is that, coming off of this year, which has been a really, tough year for everyone, and thinking about the summer and then going into next year, that this planning needs to be done like relatively quickly, and almost in some respects, depending on the size of your district, maybe like a little bit, too quickly. People have barely kind of recovered or haven't recovered at all from last year. So I'm wondering, this is something that comes up a lot, what kind of flexibility districts in particular are going to have going forward as they determine that, they didn't get it quite right now, right? In 3 months, 6 months, their needs have changed, the priorities have changed. How much flexibility do people have to rework original plans?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I answer it, I think I would push back a little bit on the idea that it's too quickly. I think, we are very clear that students' needs are urgent right now, and that we need to make sure that the resources are addressing students' urgent needs. And so that's, what we come to it with. At the same time, we absolutely recognize that these plans need to be living documents at both the state and the school district levels. It's critical that the planning occur now, that the plans be publicly available. We also know that states and districts will be updating their plans, as they should, as they get additional information, as they make more decisions, as conditions on the ground change. The experience that they're seeing in students 3 months from now will be different than what it is right now. It'll be different 6 months from now. And so we've said to states, as you need to change your plans, we're happy to engage in that with you. We expect that to happen. And we've also said to states, we expect you to provide the same to school districts.
I think the other question that has come up repeatedly is that districts in particular don't have are worried or certainly don't have any experience. Maybe a few of them had a little bit of race to the top experience, but the experience of having such a big influx of money for 3 years, and then trying to figure out how you spend that money, spend it wisely, spend it to do good things, but don't get yourself in a situation 3 years from now where you can't maintain what you've started. And I wonder whether you've seen any good resources on that, or how folks are handling that at the state level.
Yeah, I think I would go back to those 3 buckets of types of spending that I mentioned, where some of them are one-time costs. Some of them are things that you would expect to be much higher in the short term and then taper off. And then some of them are longer term investments that you want to get started using these funds. And I would layer on top of that, on the one hand, the maintenance of effort and the maintenance of equity requirements and why they're so important, which is that they ensure that there's a critical base of state and local resources that are there to continue to provide support for education. And as maintenance of effort works, as state budgets grow, that state commitment to education funding grows as well.
Yeah.
And second, I would reference the president's budget. So the president has made a very ambitious and clear commitment to ongoing education funding and to ensuring that there are resources available to meet our critical goals beyond just the American Rescue Plan.
All right, now, of course, everybody's questions are coming in fast and furious. So let me get to a couple of these. One, it just picks up on, from Arizona, just picks up on something you just said, which is, with all of this money, right, what's your advice, or what have you seen about how to design programs that really show impact after 3 years? The concern being that it may be hard with, to move the needle enough to continue investing more fully in education, especially for states where there are active conversations about how much and redoing funding formulas and that sort of thing. So what should impacts look like in 3 years? How
that's an important question. And, it's one of the reasons why the law is really specific that some of these be evidence-based interventions, that we're really able to draw on what we know works, where there's a body of evidence of various kinds, and implement those investments so that we're able to have the greatest likelihood of moving the needle on student success across a range of measures. And one of the things that I think is really important is to think about how we use the plans and how we use at both the state and local levels the ongoing stakeholder engagement and the other evidence of implementation to think about what is the narrative of the impact of this investment on improving educational equity, on supporting all students, on addressing the impact of the pandemic. And obviously, you can do that in different ways in, month one, where you're able to talk about the incredible number of students who are in high dosage tutoring, right? Then you are months down the road where you're able to talk about how that high dosage tutoring has resulted in specific academic or social emotional benefits.
Someone posted a question about they've seen an analysis of state plans, but they weren't final yet. So this may or may not be fair. And they saw a lot of really good things in those plans: teacher pay, staff hires, building maintenance, safety needs, all good. Not a lot, or not as much focus as they might have expected to addressing learning loss and assessing learning loss. And just wondering if you think that's a fair assessment, or is that something that's maybe sort of been changed in the final plans?
I'm not really sure where that assessment comes from or what plans were analyzed. What I can say is that plans have to address how states are going to use the resources to address the impact of lost instructional time, and how they're going to support school districts in making investment decisions to address the impact of lost instructional time. As I mentioned, some plans are really specific. We're going to do X. Other plans say this is the process that we're going to take to figure out what it is that we're going to do, but that has to be a part of all plans.
And I know, Ian, you said you had a couple of extra minutes. Is that still right?
Yep.
Okay.
Happy to hang out for like 5 more minutes if that works.
Yeah, that's great. So let me just ask you kind of a combined question on community engagement. One, curious if you've seen anything really innovative at the state or state level, or even heard of something at the LEA level, people approaching stakeholder engagement differently. And then secondly, you mentioned the stakeholder groups that in your correspondence with states that you are actually requiring them to tell you more information about. I'm kind of curious about what kind of engagement there is specifically around students.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think states are doing a variety of different types of engagement, and we've seen more at the state level than at the district level, just because the state plans come to us and also they're first. So the district plans will go up to the state level. And I think that you'll see, even richer examples at the district level, because districts are just closer to the communities that they serve. And states often, by necessity, have to engage with representatives of different groups. But I've seen states do some interesting work around focus groups, around trying to make sure that they are inclusive in their outreach. Very interested in students. We obviously intentionally required that students be a consulted stakeholder group from both states and school districts in the development of their plans. Mm-hmm. And I think we've seen there too a combination of things like focus groups. Some states have like advisory committees of students, or are able to otherwise tap into existing student bodies.
Great, thank you. I think, wow, and I'm sorry if I shorthanded anybody's question and didn't get that quite right. We can definitely follow up. I appreciate.
You know where to find me.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate all of that. In terms of resources back to this group that the groups would find helpful, it sounds like that best practices clearinghouse might be one thing we should point people to. Are there other things that advocates in particular ought to be looking at that's available on the Department of Ed website?
Yes, and I will do my best to paste a link into the chat, if that works, with the page where all of our American Rescue Plan resources are.
Excellent. I think we directed people to that page before, but I think it's gotten bigger more recently.
And 2 things there. If you look all the way to the right, our resource page, which includes all the guidance that we put out, and a state plan page, which, as the title suggests, includes all the state plans.
Great. All right, thanks. I've got 2 quick questions before we go. One, I didn't really introduce you properly, and apologies for that. For people that don't know, like We go way back with Ian. I knew Ian first, I guess, when you worked for Governor Rendell, and then later Ian was in New York. And many of you may remember Ian from last summer when he was at Ed Trust, New York, which he actually founded back in the day. So again, thank you again for being here. But given your position, which seems daunting, frankly, given your position right now at the department and thinking about the new school year, right, and thinking about where we're at with both COVID, systemic racism, ridiculous critical race theory, pushback, like all of these things that are sort of coming at us, and thinking about the new school year, like what keeps you up at night? Like what are the things that you're sort of most watching for and looking for?
Well, I think it goes back to the things that I said at the beginning, the areas where we're really focused right now at this point in the summer. How we make sure that we are supporting the use of evidence-based resources to protect students and educators' health and safety. Obviously, the CDC, we followed the evidence, so we followed the CDC, which put out guidance last week. Second, how we're supporting states and districts in earning the confidence of parents and addressing parent concerns. And then third, I think maybe most directly at your point, how we're thinking about all of this in the context of the pre-existing inequities that were exacerbated by the pandemic. That's really the work of the department. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, thank you for that. Closing question for you. You will not be surprised that this is a Michael Gilligan question. Who has been someone who has influenced you and why?
I am incredibly fortunate to have a lot of people who've influenced me. I think maybe he's in my head because you mentioned him, but I think about Governor Rendell a lot, who I had the amazing honor of working for during his 2 terms in office. And I think from him and the people who worked for him, among the things that I learned were just the power of public service, the importance of integrity, and that the issues and particularly when it comes to educational equity, can be the centerpiece of a really powerful and effective agenda. And that I think has really stuck with me and inspired me in the work that I've done since.
Thank you. And thank you, Ian, for your time. We really do know how busy you are and are grateful for the time that you took to be with us today. Just a reminder to everyone, we will post the recording and those resources that Ian sent to us on Slack by the end of the week. And a reminder that our next talk is with Pam Cantor on July 22nd at 2 o'clock. Pam is the founder of Turnaround for Children, and that should be a great talk. And in the meantime, we'll see you on Slack. Thanks again, Ian.
Thank you. Great to see you.
You too.